problem with something and I say you don't understand, I'm happy to stop and answer that question. I try to anticipate that. What I'd like to do kind of is one-on-one pesticide explanations and how that relates to GMO products in more than one way. I'll talk a little, this is from a larger talk, but I want to point out several things. One is that everything is interconnected. I want to talk a little bit about what we know from the literature. How can common pesticide mixtures affect learning and behavior, and especially growth and reproduction, and how can common pesticide mixtures induce chronic long-term diseases. This picture was taken by my son-in-law, Craig Schreiner, who used to work for Wisconsin State Journal. And when I first used this in my Zoology 101 lectures, I asked the audience, what do you see in this picture? And somebody in the back of the room hollered out, raging hormones. And to me, that may be true, which is still very young. But also, they represent our future. And if we don't protect our future, we won't have much of a future. And so I want to talk about how GMO products and the things that are used on GMO crops may affect our future and ours by that same token. Firstly, how is everything interconnected? We've got a healthy system. We just maybe had supper, or we certainly had some wonderful snacks here. We took in mass and energy and nutrients. These things here fuel our molecular and cellular systems. This is why we're alive. We're burning energy to stay alive. Those systems all are built into things like the central nervous system, your hormonal system, your immune system. And these three systems talk to each other all the time. There are more than 60 molecules that are involved in this communication system here. So if you get a hit on one corner, almost certainly you're going to get a hit on the other two. That's very important to remember. These two things here, the molecular cellular systems, the organ systems, are what make up individuals. And at that level, we're talking reproduction, growth, and behavior. And that supports at the population level, birth rates, death rates, social structure. And at the community level, the ecosystem level, we have immigration and immigration and relative species abundance. I'm going to explain a little bit tonight about how we are understanding now that as we use pesticides, which consist of herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, that's what we mean by pesticides. These things appear to be subverting the basic foundations upon which our entire superstructure rests. And so if we're undermining that superstructure, sooner or later that whole superstructure is going to topple. And that's one major concern that we have. GMO products may be a major part of this undermining, as we'll see in a little bit. What do we know from the literature? Back in 1998, in June, in Environmental Health Perspectives, a very famous journal, top journal in the world for environmental contaminants, there was this article called An Anthropological Approach to the Evaluation of Preschool Children Exposed to Pesticides in Mexico. This was a study down in the Yaqui Valley in Sonora, Mexico, which was initially populated by Native Americans of Inca descent. And what happened was a charitable foundation in the U.S. set up money to help the Mexican economy, and one agrochemical company bought this valley and said to these Native Americans who were organic farmers, we're going to grow fruits and vegetables here for the U.S. market. We're going to make a lot of money. We're going to pay you well if you work our fields for us. By the way, we're also going to be spraying them about a weekly or bi-weekly basis. Half the Native American population said no thank you, and they moved lock, stock, and barrel up the mountain. The other half stayed behind. And so all of a sudden we had here a human experiment on adults and on their children and on their fetuses. After a few years, it became apparent that the women who were still in this valley were developing breast cancer in very significant numbers and dying. But that wasn't why they brought in Dr. Elizabeth Gillette and her colleagues. They brought them in because their children were different somehow down in the valley. One of the things that they evaluated was their ability. They did a lot of tests on these kids, but one of the things they tested was to see how well they could draw a human stick figure. Now these were 4- and 5-year-old kids. These were the kids way up on the mountains who were not being exposed. They drew your normal figures of features, that facial features, digits on the hands and feet. That's what you would expect from a 4 or 5-year-old. Here are the drawings made by the kids down in the valley, same age. And anybody looking at these immediately can see that there's a humongous neurological deficit here, learning deficit. What you can't see is that these kids here start at the top and they work down. These kids over here start at the bottom and work up. An immediate telltale sign of serious neurological impairment. I have a sister who's an occupational therapist, and when she saw these figures, the tears came to her eyes. She said, "I've never seen such devastation." She works in Chicago. She has been working there for many years, and she works with learning disabled children. These children also have all kinds of problems. They have very short-term memory. They get exhausted very easily. They have very poor coordination. They can't walk a beam. They can't drop a clothespin into a bottle. All of the things that you would expect a normal child to be able to do at this age. I want to point out that the current status of these kids down in the valley. The teens, the boy teens, have mammary tissue now in their tender breasts. If given the right hormone, they could nurse their children. The women in this group have only fat in their breasts. There's no mammary tissue. So if they ever have kids, it'll be the boys that nurse the kids, not the girls. Now the question is, how can common pesticide mixtures affect learning and behavior and other things like we've already talked about? I want to explain to you what makes up a pesticide. Imagine that we have a leaf here. We've got an herbicide that we want, and we want this plant, we want to kill these weeds. There are two ways that you can get the poison into the plant. You can either go through the waxy surface of the leaf, or you can come in through the breathing pore of the leaf, the stomates, which is protected by a thin hemisphere of water, which has surface tension, and that tends to prevent things from coming through. So what's done to get these agents, these active agents in here, is to add two things. They're called inert ingredients or other ingredients. They're really fat-soluble solvents and surfactants, which weaken surface tension. Both of these routes of entry, then, are analogous to our skin, which is a waxy surface. And if you don't believe that, check yourself and take a shower. And our lungs, which have tiny little hollow air sacs called alveoli, which are lined by surfactants. And so these other ingredients promote rapid penetration through the skin and through the lungs, which bypass the natural defenses of the body, which are in the liver and the kidneys primarily. How do we get, so we get the herbicide or pesticide into the body using fat solvents, which, fat dissolves in fat. So that's how you get through the skin. The cell membranes are also fat. They are phospholipids. And so when you design a pesticide, you want to design a pesticide to do two things. To be fat soluble, and that's what this ring-shaped structure represents. Nitrogen, carbon, nitrogen, carbon, nitrogen, carbon. They're all hooked together in a ring. Benzene is an example. Gasoline oftentimes have those kinds of things in them. That makes them fat soluble. And then you hang off charged groups like this. This is an example of a nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. That gives you a net positive charge. That gives you water solubility. So now you've got something that dissolves both in fat and in water. And why do you want to do that? Because you have to get into the cell to kill a cell. So you use this to dissolve in the cell membrane to get yourself inside. That's your master entry key. Now the charge groups on here, physics says opposite charges attract. So since this is positively charged, it'll be attracted to anything that's negatively charged, like the electrons in the mitochondria, which is what powers your life. However, the only other problem is that there's not a guarantee it's going to go up here, because the net charge on a genetic molecule on your DNA is a net negative charge. And this flat dinner plate shaped molecule can slide right in between the rungs of this coiled DNA ladder and lodge there, and then when it unzips to copy itself, it breaks when it comes to this point. We call that a mutation. So that's basically how it is that we can have basically a molecular bull in a china shop. It could be going anywhere that has an opposite charge. like the chloride ions that are used in electrical communication in cells and between cells. Now, atrazine has a structure analogous to what I just showed you. It has that ring-shaped structure with carbon, nitrogen, carbon, nitrogen. It might be interesting to you to know, based on data that Dr. Paul Winchester has put together at St. Francis Hospital in Indianapolis. He took a look at what is the concentration of atrazine in the waters in Indiana, and how does that relate to the total math and language scores of kids when they reach high school if they're conceived in any of these particular months. And what you see is that if they are conceived in the months when atrazine is highest, you get a substantial reduction in their language and their math scores. It's also been shown that in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, up here, which is where we decide, shall I do this or shall I not do this? Atrazine at the lowest concentration, the white is no chemical, and this is 5 milligrams per kilogram. This is 10 milligrams per kilogram. The lower dose gives you the greatest effect in terms of impacts on the function of the brain. This inverse dose response or greater effects at lower doses we can talk about in the question and answer session later, but it's a common phenomenon known now in the nervous, the endocrine, and the immune systems. It's been shown in peer-reviewed journals. Now, let's get right to the most common kinds of GMO crops that require atrazine or they require Roundup Ready corn, atrazine here, or Roundup Ready soybeans. Atrazine GMO crops for corn and Roundup Ready soybeans. So what's the problem with putting some atrazine or a little Roundup on our corn or our soybeans, which constitute a very large part of processed foods? Well, both of these herbicides, turns out, affect this enzyme here called aromatase. Now, why is that important? Because aromatase is sort of like a valve. In our bodies and in the bodies of all vertebrates that we know of, you start with cholesterol, you run through a bunch of reactions, and you get to testosterone, and then testosterone is converted to estrogen, a one-way conversion. There's no way back, and that's controlled by how active this enzyme is here. So atrazine increases the amount of aromatase, opens the floodgates, and so you deplete the testosterone and you build up the estrogen. Why that is important? If you're a male, if you're in utero, you're a fetus, and you're deciding, am I going to be male or female? Because all fertilized eggs, when they are first fertilized, are bisexual, and that sexual determination doesn't happen until partway through your embryonic development. You wind up with lower sperm production. You can get ovaries and testes in the same male. You get mammary tissue and male breasts that we've already talked about in terms of humans, and changes in sexual orientation. So this feminization is through your whole body, not just in your gonads. If you have Roundup here, that tends to shut it down. That means that this can be converted this way. As a dam here, this builds up in concentration. And if you happen to be a female fetus, now you get masculinized. So when you reach puberty, all of a sudden you don't ovulate very well. You grow facial hair. You tend to put on weight. It's a symptom called polycystic ovary syndrome, and more than 10% of the women in this country have this now, and we never used to see it. How about malformed genitalia rates? Again, this is work from Paul Winchester down in Indiana, looking at the frequency of hypospadias. That means testes that never descend into the testicles that never descend into the scrotum. Here is a concentration of atrazine in the White River in Indiana, and the rate of malformations of the boys' testes as a function of when they were conceived, relative to the concentration just in their drinking water. Birth defects versus pesticides in the U.S. This is data from the U.S. Geological Survey. Again, here's the concentration of pesticides, here's how it changes over time, and here's how the frequency of birth defects does if you happen to be conceived in these months. Here's one example of something that appears to be tied to atrazine based on one paper that's out so far. This is called gastroschisis. It's a new epidemic from rural areas in Wisconsin and areas south of here.
What was that?
Those were the guts of the baby hanging out through a hole in the body wall. Obviously, this girl's going to have an operation to have her guts put back in her body. The people at Mary turned us onto this a couple of years ago when they started seeing this huge increase. You need to understand that marketing is a very important part of pesticides. In 1945 in New York's Jones Beach State Park, this truck was spraying DDT, which looks like estrogen to the body. Here's a little boy about to walk through that cloud. And that sign on there says, DDT, powerful insecticide, harmless to humans. These are the messages that we keep getting all the time. There's nothing wrong with GMO. There's nothing wrong with any of these other pesticides. They're perfectly safe. Well, let's spill that pesticide or related pesticide down in Lake Powhatan in Florida, and alligators are not able to really kind of find their gonads or their penises, actually. A good Gillette goes out at night, captures these guys, turns them over and squeezes them to see how big is their penis. It's kind of gross, but it's an example of what's happening to the animals out there. And I thought you might like to see when we have atrazine exposed to frog males, the percent of animals that do not have any atrazine and they're exposed to is very high, as you can see. If they're treated and exposed to atrazine in the water, these are environmentally relevant concentrations. Here's their fertility level. And a general principle here, again, a reminder, terrestrial vertebrates are conceived as bisexual organisms. They develop dual primary reproductive tracts. They mainly dispose of one of them during development based on the ratio of testosterone and estrogen at a decision time. If pseudo or xenoestrogens are present, it looks like to a male embryo that it is more female, and so it changes direction, induces fewer Sertoli cells, which are the sperm nurse cells in the testis, and it alters the brain's sex-centered development accordingly. What happens then is that Tyrone has pictures of two males here copulating with each other, and Syngenta, which makes this, said through Tim Pasteur, their PR man, that at this time the EPA believes that no additional testing is warranted to address this issue. By the way, atrazine not only increases the amount of aromatase, which elevates estrogen, which elevates breast cancer risk, but they also make tamoxifen, which is used for treatment of breast cancer. So now the question is, might estrogen changes alter human sexual behavior? The estrogen receptor is very promiscuous. It interacts with at least a dozen different chemicals that we know about. And Bruce McEwen, who was one of the top epidemiologists in the country in environmental health perspectives, in 1987 had an answer for this question because he looked into the literature to see what do we know about this. And what he found in this one particular paragraph in this study that I just showed you points out that further insight into actions of estrogen on brain development has come from studies of offspring of mothers exposed to the pseudoestrogen diethylstilbestrol, DES, during pregnancy. In studies thus far completed and published, prenatal DES alters general measures of personality and leads to altered patterns of sexual behavior in adolescence and adulthood that reduces the formation of heterosexual relationships. These differences from carefully matched normal subjects could not be explained by sexual dysfunctions, such as vaginismus and picdyspareunia, which were low in both groups, but rather appear to be due to psychosocial and neuroendocrine factors related to this pseudoestrogen exposure. And here are the references right here. We knew about this in 1987, so nobody's talking about it. At least not in exactly this context. I thought you might like to see what's happening to the human sperm count globally. The first paper on this was by Elizabeth Carlson and Niels Kakelbach in 1982. That's the yellow. Here are the data here. Here is increasing time from 1930 to 2013 here. These are global data from all over the planet. Here's a separate French study. The data are continuous here and showing a 3% per year decline. In Denmark, where this first study was revealed, a little bit later, Abel and his colleagues, publishing in Lancet, another medical journal, said, okay, well maybe the Danish urban males are like this, but how about the Danish organic farmers? Their sperm count is up here. All right. Okay. You might be interested to know that about 1945, 60 to 70% of U.S. males qualified as sperm donors. By about this point in time, about 1990, 6 to 7% of U.S. males qualified. Just this past year, it was revealed that only 1% of the top producers of sperm, Israeli soldiers, qualified as sperm donors, whereas 10 years earlier, 10% of them qualified. And then there are all kinds of other things going on here too, but my time is up, so I'm going to share that.